Welcome to another episode of Planet Possible. We're delighted that you're joining us to hear evidence-led discussion about topics that are critical to the way we manage our water, nature and climate. A huge thanks to our sponsors, Decisio, Arup and MWH Treatment, and you'll hear a little bit more about them later. We're really grateful for their support in bringing the podcast to you. If you're new to Planet Possible, I'm Niki Roach. I'm an enthusiastic connector of people and ideas and a fellow of CIWEM, the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. If you hear the term the green economy, but you aren't entirely sure what it is or how we make it become a reality, then today's episode is going to answer some of those questions for you. As the UK sees the appointment of new Prime Minister Andy Burnham, we're expecting the growth agenda to stay high on the list of plans, and the green economy could form a significant part of that good growth. But do we have a commercially credible pathway to develop a green economy? My guest today thinks that we don't. And he's going to share why he believes that to be the case and his thoughts on what the new government could do to change the direction of travel and enable the green economy to deliver a significant contribution to UK GDP. As a founding executive director of Natural England, sustainability director with Wessex Water advocating for better regulation, and more recently as managing director of EnTrade, designing and running real-world markets for nature recovery, he's seen how policy does and doesn't translate into practice. So I'm delighted to welcome to Planet Possible Guy Thompson. So welcome to Planet Possible, Guy. Great to have you with us.
Thank you, Niki. Absolute pleasure.
So let's start with your challenge that we don't currently have a commercially credible pathway to a green economy. What do you mean by that, and why do you believe that to be the case?
You've set the conversation up perfectly with reference to the latest political transition we are living through, cost of living crisis. We're enduring now, in a UK context, the second decade of flat economic growth, and understandably that's concentrating the minds of our political class. And we can now see through the lens of how Andy Burnham is framing his agenda for the remainder of this parliament. It's about an unalloyed focus on reducing the cost of living to households and unlocking economic growth. It remains to be seen where the green economy fits into that agenda with respect to the changes at DESNZ. But I think we can anticipate that the way in which the natural environment and the agenda for water and nature fits into that context, it will continue to be peripheral to the government's agenda. And that's what frustrates me and drives me in equal measure. It's the opportunity to take what we've established through the Environment Act and the experience of the Climate Change Act, the policy ambition that we've achieved for environmental recovery and action on climate recovery, and finding ways to involve the whole economy in delivering that transition and unlocking the opportunities for new jobs, new capabilities, and more efficient ways of investing in that transition, fairer and more efficient ways of enabling that transition, which is what we need to be about. It's not about the ambition itself, it's how we deliver that ambition. That's the exam question. And at the heart of that, clearly, is the fiscal context. So we already see through the lens of just the fairly modest commitments that the new PM has made for example, ending rough sleeping or lopping a bit of VAT off electricity bills. The debates are already raging on how those fairly modest promises can be met. That's the context in which we need to rethink, I think, the opportunities to deliver this transition to a green economy, because it's not going to be contingent on public funding. We need to think about how the incentives enable the private sector to do the heavy lifting on investing, innovating and delivering much of that environmental restoration. That's the agenda as I see it. Why do I believe this? I guess I've had a fairly unusual perspective on this in my career. I sometimes say I've done my career backwards. As somebody who followed my heart and went into the green NGO sector initially and ran Green Alliance back in the mid-2000s, at the point when I saw politicians like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown just starting to take these issues more seriously, and then moved, as you say, into the public sector as the founding executive director of Natural England with great ambition to see a flagship public body bringing together agendas around nature, landscapes and people could deliver change on the ground, and then moved into the private sector. And it's looking back through the lens of what I've been doing in the water sector to enable water companies to deliver environmental improvement and see how the incentives currently work for the water sector in that respect, and also innovating with these embryonic nature markets. Looking back from that perspective back into my old world in the public sector and my old colleagues in the environmental NGO sector just gives me a relatively unique or unusual perspective on this, seeing some of the constraints and challenges that businesses with a high cost base face in this fiscal context.
You do have a really interesting kind of, I would say, helicopter view actually over the whole of the sector that is quite unusual. Before we get too much into the detail, for listeners that might hear that term green economy but not really know what it means in practice, give me a bit of a sense of it. When you say the green economy, what do you mean specifically, Guy?
So in my mind's eye, this is about not just about net zero. Yeah, we have a clear pathway for decarbonising the economy, and that's obviously set out by the Climate Change Committee in its 5-yearly carbon budgets. And that's a very significant part of this equation. But it's also about the opportunity. People talk about climate and nature recovery being two sides of the same coin. And I think as we see the impacts of climate change and we live through the impacts of climate change this summer, we start to understand better that action on the natural environment and enabling more resilience in landscapes and in the places we live and work are going to be equally important. So in my mind's eye, it's the transition to economy where the places we live and work are sustained by revenue streams that enable, for example, farms and land managers to do their bit on managing resilient landscapes whilst also producing food. And in urban places, we have access to green spaces to recreate and to get the benefits of reduction of the urban heat island effect that comes without trees and natural spaces in and around the places we live. And we have a circular economy. We've started to understand better how we actually reduce the impacts of our consumption and the way in which we consume our goods and services on the natural environment, be that, at home or indeed the services we're exporting and importing as part of a more global economy.
And so this isn't just about what we might term green jobs, but actually how there are green services almost as well, and we're starting to pay for those services, I think, if I've understood correctly.
100%. So, people talk about the ESG bubble. So sustainability sort of got reframed for reasons were not entirely apparent to me through the course of the pandemic as ESG, environmental, social and governance. And that was a sort of strange sort of bringing together of related but rather disparate issues around corporate governance and seemed to frame the way in which funds were being raised early in the pandemic. So people talk about this ESG bubble having burst. And I think that's no bad thing in the sense that it was an artificial construct all along. The opportunity, I think, for us is to see sustainability now properly embedded as a mainstream business board issue. As a sustainability professional who's worked on these issues throughout my career, it troubles me to see boards rowing back on sustainability and this sort of narrative that seems to be setting in that boards are no longer concerned about sustainability. It's now, it's all about AI. But the more progressive businesses, and certainly businesses like, for example, the insurance sector, who are really exposed to these liabilities and can see it through that lens. And businesses are starting to wake up to, for example, supply chain risk associated with climate-related weather disruption, seasonal change. These businesses are starting to recognise they need to act. And therefore, for me, it's about embedding these issues inside business now as a mainstream business concern. But also, to your point about green jobs, creating the capabilities and the skills that business will need to actually not only deal with those risks and address those risks to ensure their businesses are future-proofed, but actually to create value. There's significant opportunities on the other side of the ledger for businesses that are thinking forward about how, for example, technological change, data analytics, these sort of new capabilities can enable them to create business opportunity out of these issues that we face as well.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, I am clearer. Thank you. I always feel like the term leaves me a little bit cold. I'm like, I don't really know what we mean by that. So it's very helpful. Okay. So we've kind of set up that premise that there isn't this clear pathway. Tell me a little bit about where we are at the moment, that kind of gap in your mind between some of our aspirations as a country and then the reality of where we find ourselves.
Yeah, so I think I look at this through the lens of Brexit as a very significant inflection point, if you like, in the way in which we've managed our politics and policy. If you look at life before Brexit, there was an established consensus. We had the Climate Change Act and the significant cross-party consensus that had been established behind that had led to Theresa May's reforms in 2019 to make the 2050 net zero target a statutory target. On the natural environment side, a sort of growing consensus that approach to that sort of predictable long-term policy ambition needed to be replicated in the natural environment in what then emerged as the Environment Act in 2021. That was quite a significant opportunity to take where we had been pre-Brexit with an approach to delivering on the natural environment which was more contingent on public funding, and particularly for what we wanted to achieve in landscapes through agri-environment schemes that we drew down from the Common Agriculture Policy, to a world in which the private sector was more centrally involved in delivery. And if you look back at the original 25-year environment plan, do you remember that? Michael Gove, when he was Environment Secretary, came in to put flesh on the bones of the then Conservative government's ambition to be the first generation to leave the environment in a better place. 25-year environment plan was very strong on incentivising the private sector to deliver these environmental improvements. And what we've wound up with post-Brexit is a slightly uncomfortable hybrid of the regulatory framework we've inherited from Europe, which has been transposed kind of piecemeal, directive by directive. Think Habitats Directive, Water Framework Directive, and so on. And overlaying on that, this ambition to deliver environmental restoration. That's codified in the Environmental Improvement Plan as we now have it, this sort of 5-yearly plan, which is reviewed by the Office for Environmental Protection. What that story is starting to tell us is that that system is significantly out of date and no longer fit for purpose in the context in which we need it to work, which is how we incentivise the recovery, the nature recovery, and not just the protection of the assets. You don't need to just hear that from me. If you look at the work that has been done over the last 2 or 3 years by the likes of Dan Corrie, who was brought in by Steve Reed, the then Environment Secretary, as an independent economist to review that system, or indeed the National Audit Office that took a good look at this earlier in the year, the very strong focus of those reviews was that the system needed a very significant reset to enable it to deliver on the ambition we now have with these statutory targets, right, for environmental improvement on the face of the Environment Act. The challenge, I think, is that government, in the context of all the volatility and the uncertainty we've been living through, has tended, and understandably, because government is always fairly short-term in its outlook and politicians are driven by short-term electoral imperatives, fall back on tactical fixes, which just complicates the system further in the long term. So, for example, I look back at the last Conservative government and what it achieved actually to the Levelling Up Act, which was to put an obligation on the water sector to deliver a nutrient reduction, and how that undermined the opportunity for more holistic approaches involving NGOs, farmers, to deliver upstream solutions. Its attempt to carve out the habitats regulations, which was essentially then picked up by this government through the Planning and Infrastructure Act, and the well-intentioned but I suspect ill-fated ambition to establish a state-led nature restoration fund, a developer levy to deliver holistic improvements at a landscape scale. The sort of tinkering around, even in the clean energy transition, we can talk about energy where this government has been much more focused and delivered much more progress in terms of the upgrades of the grid to move to an electrified system of energy distribution. But even there, we've had noises off about zero electric vehicles mandate, and the sort of temptation in the face of some of the manufacturers' concerns about costs to sort of tinker with that, undermining certainty and stability. And look, even the water reforms, where I think there is a real opportunity, actually, with the Clean Water Bill, but the sort of tendency to play with performative gesture politics, like the legislation to ban executive bonuses for water companies that were purported to be polluting, not delivering meaningful change, but playing to the gallery. It's the sort of tendency to then manage the symptoms of the problem rather than get under the skin of the really significant system reforms that will enable us to address the problem itself, which I think this government needs to grasp, and I do hope we may still see that come to pass.
MWH Treatment is one of the UK's leading water and wastewater process contractors. MWH offers a truly integrated design and build service that's uniquely dedicated to the water industry. With an innovative and future-facing approach, everything MWH does is guided by its purpose to shape a better world. As a global consultancy with extensive technical and advisory expertise, Arup works across the entire water cycle, with utilities, local and regional governments, commercial and domestic water users and partners. From designing and maintaining key water infrastructure services to advising on natural catchments and flood defences, Arup helps its clients consider long-term economic, environmental and social dimensions. Arup, like Planet Possible, is focused on making progress for our climate, water and nature. So let's start to think about what you would want to see in that case then, because I think you've set out the challenge quite clearly, and my reflection on that would be almost that there is definitely an aspiration, but it feels like, as you said, there's quite a lot of tinkering around the edges rather than some of those bold steps. So I'm interested, I suppose, Guy, what are some of the options available to the government at this point, given the reality of the situation we find ourselves in?
Yeah, and just to underline the political risk here, if we don't achieve this, and this is really what motivates me, certainly to have this conversation, we have this policy ambition, and that is, I believe, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to retain that ambition. But if we don't find ways of actually delivering, if we can't get out of this habit of willing the ends at the expense of finding ways to will the means, we do run the risk of losing that policy ambition. And we've already seen in this Parliament, the Conservative Party and Reform effectively now committed to repealing the Climate Change Act if they were to form the next government. The same risk applies to all the progress we've achieved around the Environment Act over this last decade. To come to your point about solutions then, let's look at it through the lens, for example, of water, where clearly we need to aim off for the fact that we still don't fully understand Andy Burnham's agenda when he talks about greater public control of utilities. But the nub of it is, like all politicians before him, he's set out an agenda around household bills, and understandably in the cost of living crisis, the desire to drive down the cost of utility bills to vulnerable households. That needs to be squared with the very significant expectations of the public at large that we'll see improvements in the health of our rivers, the opportunity for wild swimming and more resilient water infrastructure. And indeed on the supply side, new reservoirs and new supply to enable the housing growth and the infrastructure that this government wants to see go in to drive the economic growth. The opportunity there is to find ways of enabling the investments that the water sector can make in its own assets in conjunction with other sectors of the economy. The Aldersgate Group has just published a report on exactly this question, looking at it through the lens of not just the water sector, but the agri-food sector, the retail sector, the consumers of water in places that will need to see more resilient water infrastructure, but also invest and are subject to different rules and regulations in river catchments and places. So the opportunity through the Clean Water Bill is to start to move towards an agenda which is much more, and a regulatory framework which is much more holistic. So, for example, what John Cunliffe argued for, which is some kind of authority or entity that's going to be taking an overview on investment in a catchments level or regional level, the opportunity to think about how the different sources of investment in flood risk management, highways, agricultural land is delivered more efficiently in conjunction with the investment by water companies in their assets. That's one great example. Behind that, there's a more significant reform required, which is to take us from the formal regulation that we currently have, which tends to be quite prescriptive and focused on where regulators, understandably, they want certainty. Regulators feel they can get certainty through these kind of very prescriptive inputs and outputs they require from highly regulated sectors like water, to go to a system which is much more based on the environmental outcomes. What are the shifts that we need to see in our landscapes to achieve the ambition of the Environmental Improvement Plan? That's going to require a shift in regulation, quite a significant reset behind the current regulatory framework. But the water sector, it's a highly regulated sector. There are relatively few incumbents. There's a requirement to build trust and confidence in the environmental performance of that sector. So it would be a great place to start in the run into the next price control to think about how, with a new regulator coming and the opportunity to design a new methodology for the next water price control, how could we start to see those shifts to a more outcome-based way of incentivising the water sector as a template for the rest of the economy?
Just to challenge you a little bit on that, and I guess I spend a lot of my time thinking about the water sector, as listeners probably know. I've spent my entire career in and around it. That sounds fantastic as a concept, but what would need to happen in practice to make that possible, Guy? You're right, you referenced Sir John Cunliffe and his review of the water sector, and one of the big shifts I've seen out of that is the role of a new regional systems planner. So a kind of, not quite sure what that looks like yet, there's some work going on around that, but some sort of group of organisations that takes more of a geographical view of water rather than this organisational view of a water company does this bit, the Environment Agency does this bit, a lead local authority does this bit. That's one of the levers I can see that could drive some of that change. But is that enough? What else needs to happen from your perspective? Because what you're talking about is quite a bold transition. So what does that look like?
Yeah, exactly. And look, I've been talking about this now for a good 5 or 6 years. I commissioned some of the original macroeconomic analysis back in 2021 in my Wessex Water incarnation to float this proposal. And I've seen in 5 years an increasing tendency for people to talk this language. And that's coming from the heart of government as well as from people like me. But you're right, the practical effect of that rhetoric is yet to be seen. And the answer to your question, I think, fundamentally lies in getting under the bonnet and looking at significant reform of individual legacy regulations, like the way in which we've transposed the Water Framework Directive and indeed the Urban Wastewater treatment directive in the water context. And that was something that Cunliffe, I can't cite off the top of my head the relevant recommendations, but it was one of the 55, right? I've not heard an awful lot from government that gives me an awful lot of confidence that that's top of the agenda right now, understandably. But the point is really, this shift is not contingent on institutional change. We live in a world in which, institutional change is baked in because that commitment has been made, and therefore inevitably the energy of the system is going into thinking about how we create that new super water regulator. The risk is that comes at the expense of the detailed, patient work needed to be done on redesigning the regulatory drivers that will lead to this more cost-effective way of incentivising water company investment on the ground. So the answer to your question fundamentally comes on that piece-by-piece methodical reform of the existing regulatory framework. I think if you look at what we've done through the Dan Corrie review, there's been lots of great work on streamlining the planning and permitting system, and the Fingleton review's been overlain on that now, and that is clearly going to be the very significant focus of policymakers and politicians. But that won't unlock the value that I'm talking about, which is the opportunity to go about delivering the environmental recovery in a very different way. That's going to be contingent on regulatory reform.
Well, it's making me think I will pay more attention to, it's the diligent work, as you say, of policy, isn't it, really, and actually really translating what we've got into something new. And it'd be interesting to see whether DEFRA, and we've got a new Secretary of State now at the top of DEFRA as well, so whether Angela is interested in that kind of change or whether it's a bit more tactical, actually, and as you say, playing to the gallery. I think that's it's a good term of phrase.
On that point you make about a new Secretary of State, we know Angela Eagle was obviously Farming Minister, and my hope would be she'll therefore be bringing an agenda around the future of the farming industry. We've seen very significant policy investment in thinking about this over the last 6 months. We had the Minette Batter's review of the profitability of the farming industry at the end of last year. We've got now the farming roadmap. We've had the land use framework kind of setting out the big shifts in land use that will need to be delivered to enable integrated action on food security and environmental recovery on the ground. The question then is how we incentivise the farming sector to play their part in delivering nature recovery alongside food security. That will all hang on the incentives. If you look at that through the lens again of how we can attract private investment in growing these capabilities and delivering these shifts, I go back to the round table I attended for the launch of government's call for evidence on how the private sector could be incentivised to expand its role in nature recovery, which Steve Reed presented at a round table in the city I attended. And I heard from investors, big institutional investors around that table, that this is not a capital problem. It's not about availability of capital. It's about the policy framework. And it's about the opportunity to have that long-term, predictable, stable policy framework that generates predictable, diversified revenues for land managers at the point when you've got those revenue streams to deliver efficient solutions on the ground for farmers and land managers. You've got an opportunity then for institutional investment to come in because you've got the revenue streams to invest in. So the supply side and the role of farmers and land managers is key to this. And the opportunity, for example, to get farmers more closely involved in collaborating with their local water company to deliver more cost-effective solutions for things like cleaner water or water supply comes into play. And that's where these sort of nature markets can come in. The nature markets are mechanisms that will only work in a world in which we've got this much more outcome-based strategic approach to delivering environmental policy ambition. They're just simply mechanisms to deliver efficient allocation of risk and reward, right? And that's what we learned, what we were doing with the EnTrade markets. They work when you've got the right regulatory drivers in place. A significant gap on the nature market side will be having some kind of assurance mechanism, some kind of system of oversight to build trust and confidence of the participants in those markets, the land managers, the investors, the regulators themselves. We know that from the experience of the voluntary carbon market, but that's only part of the equation. Demand and better regulation is what will be required to get these nature markets working at scale. So all that work I've talked about, below deck, to reform the water sector, to better incentivise the water sector, to create diversified revenues for land managers, plays then into the opportunity to scale the financing of nature recovery through these nature markets.
Planet Possible is supported by Decisio, BMA's AI-assisted infrastructure intelligence platform. Decisio enables connected infrastructure planning by bringing together engineering, spatial, environmental and infrastructure data to help organisations make better, faster and more connected decisions. In really straightforward terms, just explain how a perfect nature market would work? I know that's a massive question, right? But if you can give me an example, Guy, for listeners that might not be familiar, and I'm just about holding on by my fingertips when I talk about this to people. I have a sense of it because I work in it. But if you've never heard of a nature market, how would you describe what that would look like? Maybe in a kind of water context, perhaps.
So I'd take that back to 30,000 foot up and the review of the economics of biodiversity that was conducted by Partha Dasgupta, commissioned by the Treasury in the sort of heady days of the pandemic and all this ESG ambition I've already talked about, sort of slightly forgotten, sadly. An amazing sort of treatise, which hasn't moved the dial in quite the same way as the Stern Review did on the economics of climate change. What Professor Dasgupta set out was a world in which we treat nature like a supermarket without a checkout. The value of the services are zero, right? The nature market is simply the checkout. That is the basis on which we start to understand the value of the services we derive from nature. And it creates a mechanism by which the beneficiaries of those services, and that's all of us, right? We tend to kind of homogenise these benefits and risks, and we talk about the role of, for example, the housing sector in delivering nutrient reduction or biodiversity net gain. The obligations that those sectors have is just a cumulative effect of the way in which we consume our goods and services and the way we behave. Nature markets is just an efficient way of creating a mechanism for the beneficiaries of the services, all of us, to pay for the services we derive from nature. That's the 30,000 foot answer. The answer on the ground can be there's a whole range of different mechanisms. If you have the right system of legally enforceable metrics and standards in place, and systems that enable market intermediaries to be accredited and held to account in the way they're applying those metrics and standards. And indeed, downstream of that, a whole range of opportunities for new digital technologies to enable different and more efficient ways of scaling how we monitor, report and verify the delivery of those projects and the outcomes on the ground. There's a world of value that we can unlock through those markets, but it really comes back to the fundamental challenge we face right now, which is we don't right now value the services we derive from nature, and existing regulation doesn't get us there because it defaults to these very tactical fixes to place pretty inefficient obligations largely on individual bits of the economy.
Okay, Guy, we have covered a lot in this conversation. It's been thoroughly enjoyable and fascinating. We've talked about below deck, diligent work of thinking about regulation and what that drives. We've talked about how it can create the conditions for a market to operate. There's lots to do. I'm going to pass you the now famous Planet Possible magic wand. If you could make one thing possible with the magic wand, and maybe if Mr. Burnham is listening, what would you want to make possible, Guy?
I'd probably address this to the new Secretary of State, Angela Eagle, and her relatively new Permanent Secretary, who has said some really exciting things about his desire to see DEFRA become an economic department. I'm sure Angela Eagle would share that, his incoming Secretary of State, and seems supportive of this idea of focus on outcome-based regulation. So my answer to your question is I would love to see the PermSec, the new Secretary of State, DEFRA, restructuring DEFRA around the 10 goals of the 25-year environment plan and refocusing around outcomes. So we do away with the silos. We do away with the old math versus environment and planning tension. We do away with the delivery bodies versus the core departments. There's a world of incredible technical expertise and driven public servants in that DEFRA group. And if we can, through refocusing that capability on outcomes, harness that energy to better effects and refocus on delivery, do away with the strategies and the siloed scheme design and focus those capabilities on the delivery of the environmental outcomes, pivot the whole organisation design around the delivery of those outcomes, I think we'd see a real shift in the dial over the remainder of this Parliament.
Well, I think you've set the challenge out very admirably, really. It'd be interesting to see what comes. It's interesting times, isn't it? And it does sort of feel like a bit of a reset, really. So it'll be interesting to see how DEFRA respond to it. Guy, thank you. As ever, time has flown by. We are at the end of another episode of Planet Possible, but thank you for joining us. I hope you found the conversation insightful. I hope it's given you something to think about in your world. And if you don't already, you can subscribe to Planet Possible on your podcast app and we will magically appear in your feed. We've got more fantastic guests and topics lined up for the rest of this year, so I hope you'll continue to join us for those. And all that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to our sponsors, Decisio, Arup and MWH Treatment, and my superb guest, Guy Thompson. Thank you so much, Guy.
Thank you, Niki.
That's it, everyone. And until next time, stay curious, look for those connections and imagine what's possible.